welcome to the special program tonight featuring author Rebecca Fannin, author of Silicon Heartland, Transforming the Midwest from Rust Belt to Tech Belt. We are also honored to have Rebecca's friend, investor Dan Schwartz. And I'd like to very briefly do a little introduction. First of all, Dan has accomplished so much, more than many people maybe accomplished in a lifetime. He was in the Army, he was on Wall Street, he was an investor, turned business around, he was a publisher. But most special tonight, he's a friend and host of Rebecca, the author. And our author, first of all, I want to congratulate her for the launch of her book. And on this International Women's Day, I'm really, really excited to feature a female leader, author like you. Rebecca has been a journalist, writer, advocate. I think she's also getting into investing now, investing in the Heartland. So you will hear much more about her work. At this time, I'm going to maybe turn to Rebecca. She has some exciting news to share, and then turn the whole thing to Dan and Rebecca to have a warm conversation discussion. We will have a Q&A about 40 minutes into the program. So hold your questions or type them into chat, and we're in for a treat. With that, I'm going to turn to Dan, Rebecca, and to share the rest of the program tonight.
Well, thanks, man. It's really nice to be here, and I'm in good company, I know. And look, I've been touring the Heartland quite a bit recently and have been to multiple locations. You can see them here on the screen. This is with the launch of my new book. Indianapolis, Cleveland, Columbus, Tulsa, Morgantown, West Virginia, Cincinnati, Louisville, Indiana, Cincinnati again, Cleveland, and yesterday we did a show with Steve Case of Rise of the Rest. So it's been quite the journey. This is my fourth book, and I think Dan said he liked it the best, so we'll get to hear a little bit more about that in a minute or so. But my first one was Silicon Dragon, which was published in 2008, and then Startup Asia 2011, then Tech Titans of China 2019, and finally this one. So it's been quite the journey, and now I have this global perspective and more of a U.S. Heartland perspective too. So Heartland and China going together. I've been witnessing the growth of venture capital in the Midwest. 4 times growth, up to $20 billion over the past decade. Ohio was right in there. I'm from Ohio originally, so I'm glad to see Ohio swinging big. The Great Lakes also. And Dan is from Illinois, so that's one of those Great Lakes states, and Great Lakes has 17 billion of that 20 billion. So a lot of money in the Great Lakes state. But the Rust Belt, which I also write about in my book, still needs a lot of venture capital. Only about 10% of VC deals and 6% of VC money goes to 7 Rust Belt states. So that's one of the reasons I concentrated on that area in my new book. And here you can see the trends of the venture capital money over the past decade, and you can compare the regions. It's very interesting to see the Midwest, actually the Midwest, the real heartland of our country, is the lowest. Great Lakes ranked about 5th, and we know that the West Coast and New York and Boston account for about 75% of the deals in venture capital. So there's a great divide that exists today, and we're starting to see that rebalance with more money going into the Midwest. So my book launched yesterday. It was an exciting day. Finally, I got to see it live on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Penguin Random House, my distributor. So there it is. You can go to Amazon anytime and pick up your copy. And look, I want to also note that I'm going to be out in the Heartland again doing a road trip this spring, starting in Morgantown and going to Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, Cleveland, DC, Chicago, Lancaster, Milwaukee, Madison, Wisconsin. A lot of places are coming up. So I'm really looking forward to getting back on the road and being reacquainted with what's happening in the Heartland. And there is a lot going on. So at that, I'm going to turn off my slides and we can have a conversation.
Good.
Okay.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's great to be on the podcast with you. As she mentioned, we've known each other now for about years. We actually met in home in the 90s. I've sort of watched Rebecca as she's got her books, and I can't think of anyone better to really talk about Silicon Valley, Silicon Dragon, Silicon Asia in the context of the Heartland. Let me, we were both in school. One of the key questions on any exam was compare and contrast. Perhaps you can compare and contrast the Heartland versus, say, Silicon Valley, and then let's talk a little bit about the Heartland versus, but first, where do you see the differences between the Midwest as you have seen it and traveled through it and Silicon Valley?
A lot of differences, cultural differences, for one, very pronounced cultural differences. And then in the tech scene, the technology innovation is very different from what we have in Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, it's a lot around software and AI. In the Heartland, it's a lot around industrial manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, some of these old industries that are converting to new technology today with robotics and 3D printing. And then there's a much more diversity way beyond software. Each one of these hubs or cities has its own focus. For instance, Cleveland has a lot of biotech innovation that has sprung out of the Cleveland Clinic, and it has a real good feeder there with Case Western University. Pittsburgh has Carnegie Mellon University and University of Pittsburgh, so it's very strong in healthcare, AI, and robotics. In Michigan, it's all about mobility. You know, Detroit was the Heartland capital, you know, industry, automotive, but then all that industry went away and went to China and Mexico. That was the issue with the Midwest, that these jobs went away, the factories closed, and now we're starting to see new tech coming in. So Silicon Valley didn't have that kind of background. It didn't have to recover. It was an orchard. And then all of this tech moved in, and it's very tech centric. But in the Heartland, we're still dealing with, you know, industries and corporations, big corporations in the Midwest, like Procter and Gamble, Nationwide Insurance. These are US Steel. These are traditional companies that are still active in the Midwest, and they are playing a big part in the innovation that we're seeing. They're feeders of innovation, and those feeders, some of these companies that started up, like in Indianapolis, they have become very giant companies. Like Salesforce has moved into Indianapolis, and they bought one of the Indianapolis startups. And now Indianapolis is all around software as a service, SaaS. So there's different influences in each one of these cities, and they're not alike at all. So Silicon Valley is more, you know, focused on one thing, and the Heartland has a lot of engines going. The corporations, the venture capital, the talent pool, the institutions, and of course the talent. Now with remote working becoming the end thing, now we're seeing the Heartland rise even more. The pandemic was a tipping point where talent moved in that was maybe reluctant to do so before, but now they have moved in and they're having an impact. So you're seeing new millennials working in places like Columbus. Columbus has changed tremendously from when I grew up nearby there. And it's become a very diversified city with its own tech hub. So yeah, there's quite a few differences between the Heartland, Midwest, and Silicon Valley. Not to even mention the weather. It's another major difference.
Rebecca, let me just say is just because of these structure differences, I mean, just going back to your chart, the amount of capital flowing into the heartland as you drive it there is pretty minimalist compared to certainly Silicon Valley and in California.
Yeah.
Do you see that changing? And first, do you see it changing? And then, Paul, how important is that to the growth of sort of a heartland tech center?
Yes, it is
I
growing.
mean,
It is growing. One of the driving forces is a VC firm in Columbus. It's actually named Drive Capital, and the founders are from Silicon Valley. They're from Sequoia Capital, which is one of the most prestigious venture capital firms in Silicon Valley or in China or in India, globally, really. And two of their partners left and started Drive Capital. And that alone has $1.2 billion worth of capital to invest. So it's had a major impact in the Midwest. They're investing aggressively, and they're bringing the Silicon Valley culture in. And that's a good thing, I think, because there wasn't enough venture capital, and there still isn't enough venture capital in the Midwest. There's a real shortage. There's needs to be many more shops that have set up. There are several that have already, and they're in my book, like High Alpha in Indianapolis and several others in the major cities. But there's still a huge gap in venture capital, and most of the money is in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has about half of it. And if you add in Boston and New York, you've got 75% of it. And look, there's a lot of positive things about the Midwest that could come to fruition with more capital, with more startups, with more serial entrepreneurs, like we saw happening in Silicon Valley. You know, it all escalates, and I saw the same thing in China. You know, it just takes a wave and a cluster to create this momentum. And this is happening now in the heartland, but it's still in a beginning stage, I would say. It's going to take probably a decade before we really see it, see a lot of these new tech startups make a huge impact like they have from Silicon Valley or they have from China.
Rebecca, I want to come back to that, but let me ask you a question. As you've mentioned, you have kind of a global perspective. You've been to Silicon Valley. Your book is on the land. Rebecca and I both worked for the Asian Venture Capital Journal in Hong Kong and spent a fair amount of time with China. You've been, this is a tougher. How would you pair the heartland, the industrial heartland, if you will, with, say, China, with Europe, maybe Israel? In other words, that you seem to be, the heartland seems to be very industrial versus these other places, at least the venture capital or private equity side, technology focused.
Yeah,
Probably about the
definitely.
culture in China versus Europe, yeah, and versus the Midwest.
Right. So, well, the heartland in the Midwest, outside of the Corn Belt, right? The Great Lakes area is where the steel companies, the steel manufacturers, the chemical manufacturers, the automotive manufacturers, all the automotive suppliers, we're all there. And then in Dayton, you also have the Air Force as a major component of industry in that region. So I think this industrial heritage is still there. And of course, Detroit is taking that automotive background and they're getting into electric vehicles and getting into self-driving vehicles. It's all about mobility innovation today. Look, I think that's a good thing, that the heartland really has to jumpstart from its strong points. It cannot be another Silicon Valley. It can't do that. There's not the software focus there. There's not the huge talent. I mean, there are a number of engineers, but they're graduating in AI and robotics and different kinds of advanced manufacturing, different kinds of technologies that can be applied to manufacturing. So it's not all just manufacturing. There's a lot of healthcare innovation in the heartland, and insurance too, and fintech, like for instance, Columbus is where Nationwide is headquartered. So it's been a lot of activity around insurance in Columbus. And it's very different from what I saw in China. See, I was in China when the internet boom was happening. So I saw all of the .com companies take off. And these were the basically the copycats of the Silicon Valley type companies, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Yahoo. Those were all set up in China with their own Chinese versions. And that was the original Silicon Dragon. It was not industrial at all. It was very much around Silicon Valley. Now that's grown a lot too now, because we see AI and robotics are playing a much bigger part of China's tech scene today.
So let's just continue sort of with that thought. I mean, let's talk about, say, 3 or 4 industries that could lead. You know, if we look at venture capital, which is what we're talking about here, it's highly risk capital. It's very different than private equity, for example. Where do you see the industries? You've named 2 of them. One is electric vehicles, 2 is healthcare and biotech. I mean, what else do you see sort of taking root in sort of that industrial heartland?
Yeah, look, 3D printing is one of those areas. The old line foundry business almost disappeared in the US, but now they have a lifeline with 3D printing. One of the companies that I profiled in the book is in the Youngstown area. Youngstown was one of those districts that was totally devastated when the steel companies closed up. And there's tremendous poverty in that area. And it's coming back now with 3D printing. And it's been amazing to see the universities getting in on that too. Youngstown State University has a degree in advanced manufacturing, which is really 3D printing. There's a whole Youngstown business incubator that's totally focused on 3D printing. It's 5 buildings in the middle of downtown Youngstown. And, you know, it's interesting to see some of these downtowns as well, because you can still see the mightiness of them. The tall buildings are still there. They still look very majestic. And so Youngstown still looks very majestic when you go downtown, but you know that the industries have all been transformed. And one of the hotels that I stayed in was the former headquarters of a steel company, the tube and die company, something. And so now it's a hotel. But, you know, you are seeing these transformations of these cities. But anyhow, besides 3D printing and advanced manufacturing, I think there are other fields too, in supply chain, in recycling. Sustainability is a big one. So some of that is coming out of Procter & Gamble, which is in Cincinnati. And of course, Procter & Gamble uses a lot of packaging, plastic packaging. So one of the companies that I wrote about in the book has technology that was developed at Procter & Gamble, and they're using it to recycle the toughest plastics. And it's definitely industrial. It's along the Ohio River, along this southern Ohio, in a place called Ironton, because that's where iron was, you know, iron ore was. So these towns still have their names from their past industrial glory. So yeah, that's another area I think is promising in the heartland.
Let's talk a little bit about the infrastructure. Again, one of the reasons for the success of Silicon Valley is you have not only this you have the tech companies, you have it goes back to Hewlett Packard and Intel and Apple, through Facebook and Google. But you have the law firms there. You have the VC firms, and you who've provided the capital. You have the incubators. You have the law firms. Wilson Sonsini certainly comes to mind. How do you see this heart sort of stacking up against this very powerful infrastructure in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, that's a good point, and it is one of the reasons that Silicon Valley has been so successful. Is you do have all of these services that cater to startups and to an entrepreneurial environment. That's happening too in the Midwest. Each one of these cities has co-working spaces, has accelerators, has incubators. But there is a different model that exists in the Midwest. Instead of so much of this venture capital, which is private enterprise, there are these hybrid venture development organizations, which are part state funded and part privately funded. And Jumpstart is one of them in Cleveland. In Cincinnati, there's a firm called Centrifuge. In Indiana, there's Elevate. So it's a different model that's emerging in the heartland for venture capital. But on the other hand, get back to your question about the accelerators and the incubators and the whole co-working and the services that cater to startups. That's there. And it's certainly not as much as I saw in China or in Silicon Valley during the boom years, but it's definitely there. And in the middle of these downtowns, each one of them has a tech cluster. Like Columbus has Short North and Pittsburgh has Silicon Strip. They all have these tech clusters where you can see the vibrancy of technology workers, and them hanging out together and coding software and, having coffee together. So you do see these kind of services and clusters developing in the heartland. And it's a good thing because many of these downtowns were absolutely, abandoned not only during COVID, definitely during COVID, but during the factory closings over the 70s and the 80s and early 90s. So many of these places were, still have some coming back to do. For instance, Gary, Indiana.
Again, sort of staying on that infrastructure theme, one of the great ingredients in Silicon Valley is the intellectual infrastructure. You have some really great national universities. You have Stanford, you have UCal, Berkeley, you have California, San Francisco. It's pretty common knowledge in the Valley that Stanford is an amazing source of, probably too amazing source of where professors sort of leave the university to start company. How do you see that playing out in the heartland? Are there any of sources of that type of intellectual ferment that sort of grow the heartland?
Oh yeah, definitely Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh is one. That's where Kai-Fu Lee graduated from, and he's one of the AI gurus of the world. But Carnegie Mellon is graduating very talented engineers to work on self-driving vehicles, to work on AI, to work on robotics. And I profile many of those engineers and founders in my book who are graduates of Pittsburgh's Carnegie Mellon. In Cleveland, there's Case Western Reserve University, and it's a very entrepreneurial school. I think that they are doing a good job in getting the young students out to see other places, such as Silicon Valley, and to not just be in their own closet of, seeing their own, circle, that they can see other influences. And I think that that's really important. So I applaud Case Western for doing that. And of course, in University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, that's another area where Ann Arbor has a company that was very successful there, Duo Security, in the cybersecurity space. So yeah, so many of these universities are churning out talent that can create leading edge startups with real innovation and get them off the ground. So yeah, the universities play a huge part of the growing success story of the Midwest.
How about some of the state? I know you're a Buckeye. I grew up in Illinois, the Fighting Illini. But how do you see the state universities? I mean, you mentioned Michigan, the other sort of big state universities contributing to, to sort of growing this heartland culture, heartland venture culture.
Sure. No, I have to give credit to Ohio State University in Columbus. They are not only turning out a lot of engineers, but the whole Columbus area, by the way, is booming because of the Intel plant going in. And Ohio State University and the community colleges in that area are all training the new generation that's going to come up. That Intel is going to need all this new talent, and all these companies that are supplying Intel are going to need this new talent. So yes, that is a major force in Central Ohio. It's going to change the whole landscape in Central Ohio. Columbus is only 30 miles from my hometown in Lancaster, the new Intel plant. So yeah, I think Ohio State University is doing a good job of this retraining of talent, and the community colleges too, Columbus State College, Columbus Community College also. And so community colleges are a really important part of this, because that's the technical training, right, that's needed to actually get this new technology in place.
What about?
Let me just mention one other thing about OSU, Ohio State University. They have actually been a limited partner investor in some of these funds. So the universities are also funding these new venture capital startups or venture capital firms that are starting up in the Midwest. OSU funded that Drive Capital, which came out of Sequoia Capital. So they were a major limited partner in Drive Capital in Columbus.
So maybe, I mean, again, we have a Big Ten football there. Maybe there's an incipient Big Ten venture culture. Do you see that arising at all? Instead of Woody Hayes, maybe we have Al Ratner or Steve Case kind of beginning to make the headlines.
It could be, yeah.
But I think we.
Yeah, Albert Radley.
I think we need that leadership.
Oh yeah, we do.
Yeah,
we need some heroes in the Midwest. We need more heroes. Like somebody like an Elon Musk. Well, maybe he's not a hero, but somebody like who stands out as a tech entrepreneur, like Jack Ma did in China, and others in China as well. Pony Ma, Robin Lee, but in the Heartland. We don't have those name brands yet. We don't have the Steve Jobs of the Heartland yet. And so they have been successful, but they're just not high profile. It's partly because, look, bragging is really in Silicon Valley, but bragging's not in the Midwest. People are humble. They go about their work. They're very family oriented. Work is not the be all and end all in the Midwest. It's very much family focused, and the work life is very different in the Midwest than it is in Silicon Valley, or what I saw in China for the most part too.
So I think, I mean, what I'm trying to do is knit together some of your comments here. I think we have a real challenge in the Heartland, and this is, as I say, I still root for I've lived in the West. I'm in California now. I still root for the Bears and the Cubs. But I think once a Midwesterner, always a Midwesterner, I say.
Oh, sure.
But
I agree with that.
I think, right. But how do we, and maybe Rebecca, you play a big role in this. I mean, I think you're, to my knowledge, the first to really shine a spotlight on what we'll call the Heartland. How do you begin to accelerate the trend there? Because again, you don't have the infrastructure that you have in Silicon Valley.
Right.
You don't have, you have, the Silicon Valley is very concentrated there. When we were at AVCJ, Asian Venture Capital Journal, the venture capital VC firms in the Valley used to be proud of the fact that they never invested in a company that was more than 50 miles from their headquarters.
Right.
You have Sand Hill Road. You don't have any of that in the Midwest. How, and maybe this is a wrong question to ask. How do you overcome that? How do you begin to accelerate the leadership? How do you begin to accelerate the formation of capital so that they're not last on the lists there? How do you begin to draw from the education resources that you sort of mentioned earlier? It's a question, and you spend an hour thinking about it, but you have 5 seconds. So what are some thoughts on that?
Well, look, you're absolutely right. There has to be that leadership quality in place. We need to see more serial entrepreneurs. We need to see that swing into action and have a number of successful entrepreneurs who get rich because they took their companies public or they got acquired. And that's happening in the Midwest. There are IPOs, there are acquisitions. They're just not high profile ones. They're not at the same level as Silicon Valley, and there's not as much noise around them as there is in Silicon Valley. So there needs to be more noise around what's happening in the Heartland. And I think that success will breed success, and heroes will breed heroes, and we will see it escalate. And I think during this whole 2 or 3 years of COVID, that was a hard hit for the whole industry, the whole marketplace. And I think particularly pronounced in the Heartland, which was really getting going around 2010, was really 2010, 2012, around that area. So it just started to, kick into gear, and then, COVID hit really badly over the 3 years. But actually, in the long run, the effect of COVID with the pandemic and remote working has been a plus for the region, in that remote workers are there. They can move there, and they did move there because of the cost of living is so much lower, and they want to be more family oriented, be with their families. And so we did see a mass exodus from Silicon Valley, and that is ongoing. In fact, some of these states paid millennial workers who are entrepreneurial to come back or to move, to relocate to their states. Tulsa City had a remote working program and has a remote working program. West Virginia does too. But I think on the infrastructure issue, there still needs to be more development. And what I would like to see is each state is on their own, right? Each state is doing their own thing. So, and I understand that the money comes on the state level, and they have to, justify the money that they get and the investments that they made and the return that they made. So that feeds the cycle. But it seems to me that looking at it as a region-wide perspective, that it would be helpful if these different venture development organizations worked across the region, and there was more of a coordination and collaboration throughout the region. Because right now I see states competing for projects and new investment, where it would be helpful if the whole region were worked together, because certainly there's more power in those numbers. These cities and states really struggle to compete with Silicon Valley's power or with Boston's power or New York's power, but together as a region, I think they have more advantage.
I think we're getting up to a Q&A sort of time, but let me ask you, you've kind of, your last comments kind of touched on it. You know, I was state treasurer of Nevada. Nevada has what's known as GOED, the governor's Office of Economic Development. It helped. It wasn't that great. Probably the biggest impetus they had was they basically gave Tesla all sorts of tax benefits. What role do you see government, state government playing in the heartland? You've got Ohio, Indiana, Illinois,
Yeah.
maybe Pennsylvania, Michigan.
Oh, yeah.
So
Each one of them has their own.
it seems to me it's almost crucial. Yeah.
Definitely, each one has
Crucial
its own,
that the state governments get involved. Yeah.
oh, definitely. Each one has its own economic development organization. And
Right.
each one has their own venture development organization too. So, you know, it's interesting. I'm going to be speaking at South by Southwest this weekend in Austin, Texas, and there is this organization called Midwest House, where it's the first time I've actually seen all these Midwesterners getting Midwest outfits getting together, all these economic development organizations getting together, and they're trying to say, hey, we're not flyover country anymore. We're fly-in country. We're fly-to country. So it's the first time I've seen this united effort, and I think it's a good sign. So I'm looking forward to going to Midwest House this weekend in Austin and find out what it's all about. But yeah, these economic development organizations, they all have their own pool of money. And then the federal government is feeding money too through regional innovation hubs, through the Build Back Better plan and the what they call the New Frontiers Act, and a lot of federal government money going into the heartland now too, which is another of the drivers of growth.
Okay, good. There's one question for the Q&A. I think it's a good point. Is there you didn't mention anything about opportunities in ag and food tech, which can be important. Paul Schickler raised the question in the chat.
Yeah, that's true.
But we'll save your comments for that. Yeah, maybe you can comment briefly on that, sort of the whole ag tech base.
Sure. No,
Area.
I was in Chicago recently, and they were really pushing ag tech in Chicago, and that makes sense because, you know, that was also the strong point of Chicago, and still is. There was a big expo on Michigan Avenue showcasing all of the foods and new types of foods in Chicago. So yeah, ag tech. I know that's more on the consumer level, but ag tech throughout the whole region is a major force, I guess. And I'm sure there's a lot of innovation around ag tech. One of the companies that I visited was growing produce in vertical farming and using robots to do that and AI to do that. I think we're seeing ag tech is an area, and of course throughout the Corn Belt, we saw the numbers for the Midwest. The Midwest was at the lowest of all the regions in the U.S. in terms of venture capital spending. So the ag tech can play its part.
And I'm going to sign off. We're not signing off. We're going to turn it over. But as you know, there's a number of politicians in Illinois. You should whisper into the ear of Paul Vargas for mayor, or Jay Pritzker, who actually, before he became governor in Illinois, had his own venture capital firm. So maybe you ought to send them copies of your book and suggest that they look at this area.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to Cleveland and speaking at the City Club on April 14th, and I'll be in Chicago on June 22nd, and we're doing an event there. So I'll definitely, Jay Pritzker in Chicago and Albert Radner in Cleveland. These are people who are leaders, and they can make a difference. I wrote about Albert Radner in my book, and he is making a difference in Appalachia in foundational money and mentoring as well.
Good. Let me turn it over to the people listening here. If anyone would like to ask any questions to Rebecca or our panelists, now is the time. Min, do you want to maybe moderate that?
Yes, we have quite a few questions. One of the first question is actually the recent shift in our government's industrial policy, whether it's CHIPS Act or bring the manufacturing back. People say that's a kind of taken copy from the Chinese government industrial policy book.
Yeah.
Do you see the pros and cons? Because a lot of people are free market, and do you see the pros and cons when government policy is playing a big role in the innovation space?
Yeah. Certainly the government spending in China was a major impetus. And now we're seeing the US federal government putting a lot more money, a lot more investment into science and technology and semiconductor production and regional innovation hubs. I think that that is a real plus for the US. The US is on the alert that China has gained some advantage in some leading technologies and certainly in applications of these new technologies. And the US needs to catch up. There's a definite recognition today that wasn't there. It was not pronounced,
Great.
but has become pronounced.
Yes. So another question is actually about education infrastructure. I think Dan pointed out how in Silicon Valley, from Stanford to other leading universities, we hear often about companies who want to go to Heartland, but they can't find enough talent, skilled worker, at least right now. So how long do you think it would take for the labor talent shortage to be built up? Because not everyone can do the software work, right? Move to the Bay Area, to the center, because a lot of the factory workers need to be trained. Do you see that as a 5-year out, 10-year out when that talent gap filled?
Yeah, no, I'd say at least 5 years. It was interesting that one of the companies, places that I visited right outside of Detroit was training new automotive engineers in some of the new technologies that are coming up. It was totally focused on that. It was very interesting to see that, but I think at least 5 years and a decade before the Heartland sees the kind of serial entrepreneurship and the venture capital escalation and the heroes coming out that we've seen in Silicon Valley or in China. It's gradual, the pace is a lot slower in the Midwest than ever in China. China was terrifically fast, and Silicon Valley during the boom years, during the dot-com boom, was very fast. So I managed to be in all of these tech booms. I've also managed to be in some of the tech bust as well. So hopefully the Heartland can avoid these tech busts and just keep going, because there is such a foundation of all these companies and different types of industries in the Midwest. It's a good foundation.
Thank you. I think Jason also got some questions that have been collected. So Jason, please.
Well, first, I kind of selfishly want to ask a question, Rebecca. I don't think I've mentioned it, but I'm not too far from Lancaster. I grew up in Tuscarawas County, and something that intrigued me through our talk tonight is, I think you really well established that the culture here in the Midwest, the Rust Belt, the Heartland region is just so different than Silicon Valley. So I'm kind of curious, in this next decade, when we're growing, we're kind of coming into our own. What do you foresee that culture becoming? If more money floods into the region, kind of existentially, I think our identity will be a little bit different depending on the region. So what do you foresee that becoming?
Yeah,
and do you think the Heartland? Yeah.
This could change the culture. More millennial type workers moving in who want things like Uber rides. And they want their food delivered to home. They're kind of spoiled, and it's a different kind of culture from work hard, get ahead, keep your head down. That's the culture of the Midwest. very, determined, rugged, you put up with anything, right? But the new generation's not doing that. And you're seeing a lot more diversity in the Heartland now too. The minority population is quite strong in places like Detroit and Columbus and Cleveland, and that is also getting to be a stronger force because there's more money going into minority entrepreneurship. There's specific funds that are devoted to that, and in the Heartland, many, I write about at least 10 new minority funds in the Heartland, and I've written quite a bit about the venture capital firms that are focusing on minority entrepreneurs, and I bring women, I guess you could say women as well.
I have a question for Dan. Dan, as an investor and rooting for the Heartland, what percentage of your investment is going to deals in the Heartland right now?
Min, that's a tough question on this show. I think as your intro bio mentioned, I'm actually a member of the Band of Angels, which we're out of San Francisco, the Silicon Valley there. And I'm sort of co-chair of a digital media and entertainment, they call it SIG, Special Interest Group, which is a particular interest to me. I started a company called Kiosk, QIOSK.com, which had we started today, we'd be put in the Smithsonian. We were actually one of the first digital delivery platforms for print media. And I can only laugh to think that just it was a time and place, but today it would be almost irrelevant. Although at the time it was innovative. All of which is to say is that I have not invested in the Heartland. And one of the reasons I say I'm very interested in digital media, digital entertainment. And as Rebecca has pointed out, that's not really, other than 3D printers, which is really kind of the hardware. It's really not one of the fortes of the venture Midwest, which is not to say I wouldn't be interested, but I just have not. We haven't seen anything in our SIG, Special Interest Group, and I don't think. And Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think there's of a drive in the Heartland for those areas. If you can think of anything, let me know.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Keiretsu. Keiretsu Forum has a very big chapter in the Midwest, going back and forth between Chicago and Indianapolis. And there's another group called Endeavor Midwest, which is a global organization, which is about startups and investment in startups. And they have a strong Midwest component of that group. Endeavor Midwest. It's out of it's out of Louisville, actually. Very interesting to see some of these Midwestern varieties spring up of kind of the Silicon Valley model. So Keiretsu Forum, Keiretsu is big in San Francisco, but they're also big in Chicago and Indianapolis.
Okay, good. I will look into it. My brother's in the hotel motel business, and I know he goes a lot. He goes between Chicago and Indianapolis and Toledo, Louisville, but say more of that type of activity than it is sort of the digital media, digital entertainment area.
Right. Yeah. Digital entertainment. LA is it for digital entertainment, if you ask me.
Right.
LA.
Great.
But San Francisco doesn't really have that. I mean, it has some, but if you really, TikTok is in LA area, for instance.
We have another question from Daryl Irwin. By the way, Daryl I guess Daryl knows Dan. from, he said that you might want to mention his friends are G.N. Pritzker and Karen Pritzker. But anyway, Darren has a question for Rebecca. Rebecca, you write quite a bit about the flow of capital. Can you comment on the flow of goods? Does the Midwest have the logistics to serve international flow of goods? I can't wait for your book and we'll order it for the University of Connecticut library where I teach.
Oh, Connecticut was that?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Well, yeah, logistics, Cincinnati claims that it's the great supply way because Amazon is there and because it's at the crossroads of the country. Cincinnati is promoting itself as the great supply way. So it's all about logistics. And it's interesting because I'm going to be doing a program in Cincinnati on, April 11. And one of the people that I'm having speak there is a person who is in innovation at the airport. That's her title. She heads up innovation at the airport. And many of these cities are very proud of their airports and how modern they are. But I have to say that compared to what I've seen in China, maybe not quite as modern as that. But, look, for the Midwest, they are very modern and they are getting that infrastructure in place is a way to attract big companies. Like, for instance, Amazon has a major hub around Cincinnati and Louisville, and UPS, of course, is there too. So I think logistics is an important part of the Heartland story, and certainly the railways have played their part. Although lately the railways have gotten very bad image in Ohio with all these train wrecks, and we do need much more investment in infrastructure.
The question actually leads to maybe a question both Dan and Rebecca can talk about, which is capital flow. We work with a professor at University of Chicago who actually talked about the global, actually U.S.-China capital flow. What's really interesting, as you know, we're right around the time of Select USA. To our knowledge, there are many Chinese investors, private investors, are looking for deals because they're looking for better returns. They're looking at the United States. But we also know right now, a Chinese investor might not be the most welcome. And I was wondering, Dan, in your perspective, since you're in the Silicon Valley, where many funds has Asian investors, how is that kind of, oh, this is a Chinese investor? Does that have the kind of stigma as sometimes we hear in the Midwest?
Min, I can say this pretty comfortably. I think there's zero stigma in Silicon Valley for Chinese or Asian. In fact, I saw this 2 years ago, but something like 30% of the entrepreneurs and CEOs in Silicon Valley are of Asian descent. So maybe in New York or Cleveland or Chicago, although I doubt it's there, but absolutely zero stigma in the Valley. So I think the bigger issue now, and my wife is actually Chinese, so she's warned me to be very careful of what I say about China. But I think the issue is now political, and if you followed any of the Asian public companies, they're all down, and I think that the Chinese government, really needs to assess its activity, both in the high tech area and generally in the economy. But I can say without any question is that Asian entrepreneurs are more than welcome in the Valley.
Oh yeah, definitely. But in venture capital, now there is this decoupling of China and US venture capital. There's reluctance to take money from any venture capital firm that has China ties among entrepreneurs. There's a lot of scrutiny from the federal government over funds that have China deals and China money. And now we're starting to see those teams split and do their own kinds of deals. And you've seen withdrawal from China of US venture capital firms. to seeing some of the partners, lead partners, want to disassociate themselves with China, don't want anything to do with being seen as favoring China, even though that may have been where they made their career, where they had their best investments. And now today they don't want to be associated with it. They would rather be associated with India or Southeast Asia.
Right. You know, given your global experience for both of you, as you know, there are company in Israel, company in Germany. We were talking to our member, actually we had an event with AmCham Shanghai. They were talking about when you go to the Shanghai business community, the Germans are there really excited about business opportunity, and there are Italians or other companies. So their really concern is actually US decoupling from one of the biggest innovation hub, one of the biggest actually engine of the world economy. Do you see the downside of this kind of over politicalization of the innovation ecosystem?
Yeah, before we saw collaboration and cooperation in R&D and in venture capital, but now that has been minimized because of this political scrutiny, because of the geopolitics that's entered into this arena and caused this backlash and the crackdown on both sides, both the China side and the US side. And I think that is actually going to hurt the development of technology in the long run, because if we could work together to develop new AI models, new ways of dealing with privacy issues, and better AI, better self-driving vehicles, better healthcare, a cure for cancer, all these things would be beneficial with more of this. If we could get back to an era of cooperation and collaboration again.
Yeah, great. Well, Jason, I know you
Yeah,
have.
and I it's a real shame. If we, I think it's real because when I was at AVCJ and really through the early teens, cooperation between China and the Silicon was very strong.
Yeah.
And I want the political effects, but my good friend Bon, I saw we don't know what happened, but he is no longer visible. And he was truly a great banker and a great deal maker. So
Yeah. Well,
I'm
I
sort
hope
of
that
hoping
he
the Chinese
returns again.
government.
Yeah.
I hope the Chinese government has a rethink on their approach to technology and venture.
Yeah, I think again, you're right, because even the Jack Ma, I heard he's doing watercolor in Japan. So I don't know how true
Well,
it is.
Right.
and he's a very innovative guy. He's a very creative guy. He can give a lot to society. I mean, he did with Alibaba, but he has more to give, and he's played a major part in the environment as well.
Right.
So look.
Well, I know we're running out of time. Jason, do you have maybe one more audience question that was submitted you could share? Then maybe we have Rebecca and Dan make a closing comment after that.
Yeah, so one last question that we did receive from the audience, kind of going back to Asian investors. The question we received was, what Asian nations do you feel invest in the Heartland the most? And do you feel like that trend has gone up or down in the past 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think it was China. Yeah, China was acquiring, making deals. There was a lot of inflow for several years, and now it's slowed to a trickle. And yeah, I think maybe what would be the leading country today?
Korea?
A European, maybe Korea. I mean, it's hard to say, I think. But it was China in a big way. China-US deal flow is very big. China to US, very big. And I write about that in my book. I write about how Chinese came in. And actually, one of the deals that I wrote about was Lordstown Motors out of Youngstown area. And Foxconn eventually took over that plant from Taiwan. So that was kind of an interesting play. But another company that I visited in Dayton Polio Glass was taken over by a Chinese company and has actually done very well since under Chinese ownership. We saw a number of deals like this and throughout the past decade, but they're really slow now because of geopolitically. It's very hard to get a deal passed through the U.S. government. There's all this scrutiny over national security, and of course we saw what happened to Huawei as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dan. And do you have any closing remarks, comments? And then we give the last word to Rebecca.
Thanks, Min. Yeah, I mean, I think I've really enjoyed this. I've learned a lot. I think the big issues in terms of Silicon Heartland, as one is leadership. There needs to be some a leadership group that comes out of the Midwest. I think it's incumbent upon the universities really to begin to catalyze some of these tech startups. And then I think three is it would be great if the Heartland sort of focused on its areas of strength, whether it's EVs, whether it's ag, whether it's healthcare. And I think, you know, it's a lift, maybe a heavy lift, but as a Midwesterner myself, I'd like to think that it's the Heartland is a great place to incubate businesses.
Yeah, I think so. And, you know, talking about leadership, yeah, I didn't mention John Chambers before, but John Chambers is giving back in a big way to West Virginia, his home state, to Morgantown University, West Virginia University, and there's the John Chambers College of Business and Economics. I'm going to be speaking there March 30th. And then there's Brad Smith from who has also taken a leadership position in West Virginia, now president of Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia, his hometown. He left Silicon Valley and moved back to West Virginia. You know, Huntington is like 45,000 people. And so these two are leaders, and they are making a big difference in West Virginia in showing what can be done, because these guys were hugely successful in Silicon Valley. They both left West Virginia for Silicon Valley. They made their money in Silicon Valley, but now they're giving back. So there's a chapter in my book where I call them the champions, and they're people like that that can help to lift up the whole region.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Dan, Rebecca, for giving back to the Heartland community, to our community. I also look forward to having a business school named after Dan Schwartz, and maybe start a fund named after Rebecca Fannin. So thank you for sharing your insight. Again, we really, again, I'm a transplant. I came to the US in the 90s, but the Heartland is my adopted family. You know, I feel very much home here. You know, I'm from, you know, Heartland, China, came over here. So I definitely am rooting for the Heartland. And thank you so much for your time. And good luck with your book tour. And I look forward to hearing more about your good work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Min. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.